This is Earth Science Lecture number 25 on volcanic hazards and tectonic settings. In this lecture, we're going to look at first just a set of different volcanic hazards and what produces them, such as pyroclastic flows, lahars, and deadly gases. And then we're going to look at various characteristics of the volcanic activity that will happen in the vicinity of a hotspot and also in the vicinity of various plate boundaries. To first start with volcanic hazards, we learned in class that the type of volcano that's called a stratovolcano, also known as composite, happens to be the most deadly and the most dangerous. And the reason for that has to do with its tendency to have what's called a pyroclastic flow. For example, Mount Vesuvius in Italy led to a pyroclastic flow which buried the city of Pompeii in AD 79. There's been cases of pyroclastic flows happening in Martinique in the Caribbean, burying entire towns by this flow of volcanic ash. And so how this occurs is basically it's a hazard of a composite volcano or stratovolcanic eruption because if you recall in class, composite volcanoes are prone to having very explosive pyroclastic eruptions. And the pyroclastic eruption produces an enormous amount of burning ash, which is that microscopic dust-sized pyroclastic solid particle. And since the ash and the gases that come out of the volcano are heavier than air, these can actually avalanche down the side of the volcano, really incinerating anything in the path. And so we wind up really having a lot of destruction, and it's also very unpredictable exactly where the pyroclastic flow will go. The next variety of volcanic hazard is called a lahar, and a lahar is a very fast-moving mud flow. Now these are also something associated with the composite slash stratovolcanoes because these volcanic landforms are actually really quite tall and they tend to be snow-covered on the top. When you have a volcanic eruption, all of the ice and snow that's covering the summit of the volcano instantly melt. It mixes with the ash and comes out of the volcano and basically leads to an enormous mud flow that basically buries everything that's in its path. You could also have lahars when there's a lot of heavy rainfall in a volcanic area because the sediments that compose the bedrock, will cover the bedrock in the landscape, can often be filled with lots of volcanic ash from previous eruptions, and that ash can mix with the water and really start to liquefy and be a really big hazard. The third volcanic hazard that we'll consider is the deadly gases. In class we saw that the dominant gas that comes out of a volcano is steam, water vapor. It's about 80%. But there are also some very deadly gases, carbon dioxide, hydrogen fluoride, and sulfur dioxide. These gases, if they're present in large enough amounts, they could actually suffocate animals and people. And the really big hazard lies because the gases are actually heavier than the air, so they tend to linger down close to the surface. And so if you walk down into a valley, sometimes people will be unaware that this valley is actually filled with these deadly gases, and in many cases the gases are odorless, and so they have no idea, and basically they just suffocate and die. So going on to the second part of the lecture, I wanted to look at the different tectonic settings that produce the different types of lava, which in turn produce the different types of volcanic eruptions. And so let's first just consider how and why rocks melt. We've been discussing this a lot in class, and one of the big reasons why rocks melt is because the temperatures, as you go down deeper and deeper inside of the Earth, the temperatures get higher and higher and higher. And here I have basically a graph basically showing how the temperatures rise with depth inside of the Earth. So by a depth of maybe around 350 or so kilometers, which would be around 200 miles or so down inside of the Earth. So really just within the asthenosphere, so a very shallow portion of the upper mantle, the temperatures are nearly 3,000 degrees. And so the way you could describe how the temperatures increase with depth is referred to as the geothermal gradient, how temperatures rise with depth values inside of the Earth. Now, an interesting question is that if rocks can melt at temperatures, so we could go into a laboratory and take a mineral and we could expose it to various temperatures and we could see what the melting temperature of that particular mineral is. And actually, it's been discovered that typically most of the rocks that make up the crust of the Earth melt at temperatures between 800 to 1,000 degrees Celsius, or between about 1,500 to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Why aren't the rocks in the mantle melted? We saw in the Earth's interior lecture that predominantly the mantle is solid. So why don't they melt? Well, not only as you go down inside of the Earth do you have an increase in temperature, you also have an increase in pressure. Pressures also increase very dramatically as you go deeper and deeper. And actually, the more pressure that's exerted on a rock makes the minerals resist melting, because minerals need to spread out and occupy a greater space when they melt, and they can't do that when they're being confined and under a lot of pressure. And so why we get different types of volcanic eruptions on Earth really is controlled by the characteristics of the lava. As we saw in class, the viscosity of the lava is very important. Remember, viscosity is how viscous, how thick a lava happens to be. So how easily it can flow like water, or how thick and gooey it is and resisting flow. This is strongly influenced by how much silica is present. So remember, there's a lot of ferromagnesian minerals or non-ferromagnesian minerals. The more of the non-ferromagnesian, the lighter colored minerals, the more silica is going to be present. And likewise, by the temperature, the cooler the lava, the thicker and the less it's going to be able to flow. So composition is another big part. Most lava does have a lot of silica within it, but depending on how much silica is present, being mafic or felsic, you can control how thick and gooey the lava will be. It also, though, depends on the amount of dissolved gases. Water vapor and carbon dioxide, if you have a lot of dissolved gases within the lava, it actually makes it more thick and viscous and more resistant to flowing, and so you could tend to have a more explosive eruption. And last, we just can consider temperature in more detail. Usually it's going to be that lava is in a temperature range between 750 degrees Celsius and about 1200 degrees Celsius. But an interesting thing can happen. If you actually have a lot of water mixed in with your lava, you actually change the temperature at which it will melt. Water actually lowers the melting temperature, so lavas will actually be able to melt when the temperature isn't as great, and in turn the pressure isn't as great, and so you could actually create lavas if a lot of water is present. Now this is an image which shows where volcanoes are occurring on Earth's surface, and the caption here says, "Do all volcanoes happen at plate boundaries?" It's a little bit hard in this figure to see the plate boundaries, but they're shown with the green lines. And looking around, we could look at the boundaries of the Australian plate, the boundaries of the Pacific plate, the boundaries of the South American plate, the North American plate boundary, and the Atlantic Ocean. And so actually, a lot of volcanoes are found on Earth not at an exact plate boundary. And the ones that are shown here with the yellow color, like Hawaii is a perfect example. It's a little bit hard to see here, but Hawaii is just about as far away from a plate boundary as you could get. It's in the middle of the Pacific plate. These yellow dots are actually a type of volcano which is called a hotspot. And how hotspots will form, if we could take a slice through Earth, we can envision that actually very deep inside of the Earth, possibly as the remnant of a subducted plate, we have material that's much more buoyant and melted than everything else, and this material rises up to the surface because it's got a very low density. And where this plume of magma rises up and reaches the surface, it erupts and produces a volcano. And an interesting thing about hotspots is that the volcanoes that are occurring on Earth's surface are not related to plate boundary interactions. They could actually happen right in the middle of a plate. Sometimes they happen at plate boundaries, but not always. So here's a map showing where most of the world's hotspots happen. They're shown with the red dots, and the plate boundaries are shown again. Places like Yellowstone in North America, Hawaii, really do happen very far from a plate boundary. All of these that are happening in Africa. Some do happen on plate boundaries, like Iceland, Easter Island, and Galapagos Island happen right along a divergent plate boundary. But they really are kind of an interesting thing, and scientists don't really know why they happen where they do. We just know that it seems to be this case where you have this very, very long-lived plume of magma that rises up from very deep inside of the earth, and where the magma reaches the surface, it erupts and produces a volcanic eruption in a volcanic island or a volcanic zone if it's underneath the continent. An interesting thing about hotspots is that we don't just find a hotspot. We actually find what's called a hotspot track. So for example, in the vicinity of the big island of Hawaii and the Hawaiian island chain, we actually have where the current volcano is happening in the volcanic activity under Kilauea on the big island. But if we go in distance away from the hotspot to the other islands in the volcanic chain, we could go to Maui and Oahu and Kauai. We see that the volcanoes on these islands haven't been active for progressively longer periods of time. Like the volcanoes that are on the last island in the Hawaiian island chain, Kauai, they haven't erupted for 5 million years. If we go in distance from Kauai to further in the Pacific Ocean, there are actually lots of more volcanic islands that get progressively older and older and older and older and older. And so this thing is called a hotspot track. A hotspot track is an active volcano followed by a chain of progressively older inactive volcanoes. And hotspots are interesting because we think that these landforms will develop as a plate basically moves over this fixed source of magma. So if I could open up this animation. So hotspot volcanoes. In this animation, we have the upper mantle of the Earth, and the brown layer here is the lithosphere. The yellow is supposed to be like the oceanic crust. The blue is supposed to be the ocean, so very, very thin ocean, and then the light blue is the atmosphere. And so in hotspot volcanic activity, we have a plume of magma that rises up, burns through, and basically creates a volcano on the surface of the Earth. But because plate tectonics is occurring, the plate that lies above the hotspot moves away, and so we start to create successive islands or volcanoes on the land that get progressively older with distance from the hotspot. And so it's a very slow process. If you look at the time scale down here, this is between 0 million years and 50 million years in the future. And so hotspot tracks are kind of interesting, and especially in the case of Hawaii, because there's actually a very new island that's in the stages of development. If you go with some distance away from the big island of Hawaii, there's actually an area of volcanic activity that's still on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. It hasn't built up high enough to be an island. It's still below the surface of the water, but Hawaiians have given this a name. They call it Loihi, and if we come back in about 1 million years, that volcanic area will rise up and actually form an island and be above sea level. It has quite a distance to go. It has to grow up about several miles from the seafloor, so it isn't something that happens instantaneously. So when we look at hotspots, is it possible for us to describe what kind of volcanism we would expect? If hotspots occur in the ocean, we can consider what's melting to produce magma. Well, we have magma that's rising up from very deep inside of the mantle of the Earth. So it's very, very mafic magma. And this magma then will burn through and essentially come up through the oceanic plate. And so just to give some more details about the oceanic hotspot, the position of the plume, interestingly, doesn't change for a very long period of time. It pretty much remains stationary, although plates will move over these hotspots. Another interesting thing about oceanic hotspots is they have somewhat of a random pattern. But going back to the type of magma that will be created, since essentially you're melting, you have material that's very mafic because it's coming from the mantle of the Earth, and when it burns through the oceanic plate, remember, is basalt, so it's also mafic. So the type of lava that will develop typically is very low in silica and very rich in the ferromagnesian minerals. And so since the lava does not have a lot of silica in it, you typically get these very gentle volcanic eruptions, non-explosive volcanic eruptions of liquid lava. Liquid lava can very easily come up from Earth's interior and exit and form these volcanic landforms. And so it will create these shield volcanoes. Remember, shield volcanoes are very, very broad and flat. And the reason why is because there's so much lava that comes out of them. And the lava can basically spread out over a very, very broad, wide area. Now you get a different scenario when a hotspot comes up through a continent. In the case of places like Yellowstone, this rising hotspot, initially it was very mafic as it melted through the mantle, but then it has to go through the very thick continental crust to reach the surface. And remember, the continental crust is very rich in silica because it has all of those non-ferromagnesian minerals. And so what happens is the hotspot melts the continent and it actually creates a very silica-rich magma, probably some of the most silica-rich magma that we have on Earth. And the result of that is a very, very explosive volcanic eruption. So an example of this would be Yellowstone. The largest historical eruption, well, actually it wasn't historical, the largest geologically recorded eruption of Yellowstone was about 60, I'm not saying this number correctly, 600,000 years ago. 600,000 years ago was the last big eruption. And so it's very heavily monitored. We don't predict that there'll be another big eruption of Yellowstone in any time in the future, but this is an earth-changing volcanic eruption. It's so explosive that at Yellowstone you actually don't have any sort of volcanic landform. What you have in Yellowstone is an enormous pit left over from the crust being obliterated and thrown up into the atmosphere. This pit is called a caldera, and if you look at the scale of this is actually taking up the whole corner of the state of Wyoming, Idaho, and parts of Montana. An enormous depression was produced from this last volcanic eruption. And so when these types of continental hotspots erupt, it actually leads to earth-shattering changes because there's so much debris that's being thrown up into the atmosphere, basically blocks out incoming sunlight, and you wind up leading to a lot of plants dying off because of the lack of sunlight, and anything that eats plant dies off because it doesn't have a food source, and basically you go up the food chain and you wind up having mass extinctions on a planet. Now, I just wanted to point out that with this Yellowstone caldera, we actually also have a hotspot track. There's the location where the hotspot is located today, which is right under this national park. If you go to Yellowstone, you'll see things like geysers and all sorts of geothermal activity. But if you go away in distance from the hotspot, you actually get a region where you have lots of what are called flood basalts, basalt that actually came up to Earth's surface and in such an enormous volume that it basically blanketed an enormous region going through the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Northern California. And so we could talk about this a little bit more in class, but there's a hypothesis for how you could create so much lava at the surface of the Earth in a hotspot track. So we'll look at that a little bit more in class. Now, what about plate boundaries? Remember when we were looking at plate tectonics in class, there were two types of plate boundaries that led to volcanic activity. You have volcanic activity at divergent plate boundaries and also at convergent plate boundaries when subduction occurs. So first let's look at divergent plate boundaries. At a divergent plate boundary, remember most of these happen on the ocean floor, and so you basically have a crack that opens up from the rifting and the seafloor spreading that's happening as the two plates are moving away from one another. And so instantly what comes up at that crack is material from the mantle inside of the Earth. And since the mantle is very mafic, there's not a lot of silica in the lava, so you typically do not have very explosive eruptions. But interestingly, the reason why we get this volcanic activity is because basically right at the plate boundary, the oceanic crust is very, very thin. And so the temperature of the rocks in the mantle are high enough to be melted, but they're under a lot of pressure and weight from all the layers on top of them, except at the plate boundary. Because at the plate boundary, the oceanic crust is really thin, and when it breaks open, the pressure is released and instantly the rocks there will melt. And so the magma is created by this partial melting of the mantle. You get a cool type of volcanic landform called a pillow basalt because the lava rises up at the divergent plate boundary along the ridge, and when it hits the water, it actually causes it to chill quite rapidly, and it forms these kind of rounded landforms which are kind of in the shape of pillows. Now, the other kind of plate boundary, convergent plate boundaries, when you have subduction, so remember that happens when you have an oceanic plate colliding, either an oceanic plate colliding with another oceanic plate or an oceanic plate colliding with a continental plate, you will have volcanic activity. You have a trench as a physical landform, and you also have a chain of active volcanoes like shown here. Now, subduction zone volcanic activity is kind of interesting because this is actually a process that occurs because of the high water content that's within the subducting plate. Keep in mind, the plate that gets subducted is an oceanic plate that's sat on the bottom of the ocean for hundreds of millions of years. There's lots of little cracks in the crust, the oceanic crust, and water can seep into these cracks. And so as the plate subducts, the plate gets heated up as it gets deeper and deeper inside of the Earth, and eventually the water that's actually in that subducted plate is released. And the water instantly lowers the melting temperature of the rocks above. And even though they were solid before, now they melt at a lower temperature, and so you create magma. And this magma is coming up to the surface of the Earth and typically becomes a little bit more silica rich because it's actually melting either the oceanic plate or the continental plate. Actually, the more of a continental plate is melted, the more explosive the volcanic activity will become. But the composition is more in an intermediate range between mafic and felsic. It's definitely more silica rich than the mafic compositions that we've been looking at before. And so the result of this is that we get much more explosive eruptions because of the silica that's added to the magma. And this is where stratovolcanoes are produced. You could also call these the composite volcanic landforms. And so if you recall in class, they're called composite because you have progressive layers of pyroclastic eruptions where the very felsic lava explodes and solids are thrown out into the air. But then you could also have liquid volcanic eruptions too, and it forms these very large landforms. I just wanted to point out some interesting results of the changing settings due to plate tectonic activity. If we can reenact what was happening in North America way back when, actually I think I'm going to open up this animation someplace else. I'm going to just bring up the actual file. I think I want to play it backwards. So in the setting along the west coast of North America, we have a situation, which I'm just going to fast forward. I like to play this animation backwards for some reason. So we have here, this is the little Juan de Fuca plate that's subducting under Northern California, but mostly Oregon, Washington State, and going up to British Columbia and Canada. And so what scientists have been able to do is pull the Juan de Fuca plate out of the subduction zone. But first, let's just consider, since this little plate is subducting here, remember there's going to be a chain of active volcanoes, and there's a trench in this vicinity. But if we go backwards and pull the subducted plate out of the Cascadia subduction zone, the plate was actually much larger in the past, and so the chain of volcanoes that was in this zone actually extended down through California in the geological past. And if we keep on pulling it out, scientists think that going back to about 40 million years ago, there was actually a subduction zone that completely went along the west coast of North America and the west coast of Mexico. And this plate is given a name. It's called the Farallon plate. But if I just play the animation now, the Farallon plate basically subducted faster than it grew at the divergent plate boundary. And so it's shrinking and getting smaller and smaller as time goes on. You might wonder what's going to happen to the future of that plate. Eventually, it's all going to subduct away. And so I have another animation here of that same process. So here is the west coast of North America starting about 80 million years ago. Here's the Farallon plate. There's another plate over here, and in this part of the diagram is the Pacific plate. And so if we play the animation, you can see that the Farallon plate basically gets subducted until the point where it's really, really small and very little of it is left today. And so today, the remnants of the Farallon plate are what we call the Juan de Fuca plate and the Cocos plate. I just have one more slide from this lecture to show you. And this is kind of an interesting aside regarding the volcanoes of the Pacific Northwest that we're just looking at. So associated with the subduction of that little Juan de Fuca plate, we have volcanoes in California, Oregon, Washington State, and going up into British Columbia. And this basically shows the history of volcanic eruptions that each of these volcanoes has had. And one you might notice that's been pretty active is Mount St. Helens. But as time goes on and that Juan de Fuca plate subducts away and gets smaller and smaller, we could expect that less and less volcanic activity will occur in this zone. But that's not going to be for some million years in the future. So we'll end the lecture here, and in class we'll do a couple of activities that will try to reinforce these concepts.